In the most recent dev stream, we learned that a Zephyr rework is on the way. In my opinion, she's one of the more fun warframes to play, but she usually ends up being fairly underwhelming. She has a solid theme and direction, but only one, maybe two of her abilities really end up being that useful in higher levels. That and her passive is really just a gimmick. That said, I've been gathering some suggestions for her over the past few months that I think would suit her well, while preserving as much of her current form as possible, especially since it was stated that she would be staying fairly similar to how she currently is. Should also preface this by saying that a few of these changes, specifically the ones to Dive Bomb, are inspired by a post made on Reddit about a year or so ago by a user named Naminesco, probably not pronouncing that correctly. Now they may or may not care, but credit where credit is due. Like I said, I do quite like Zephyr and her playstyle, and I really don't think she needs any massive changes to make her good, which seems to be somewhat contrary to the overall feelings of a decent chunk of the community. A lot of people think that she needs her 2 to be replaced, and others think that her 1 should be able to be toggled, allowing her to just fly. I don't necessarily disagree with either idea, but I don't really want her identity to change too much. And frankly, I couldn't come up with a suitable replacement for a Dive Bomb that didn't just feel like a carbon copy of another ability that some other warframe has. Anyway, I'll stop rambling now, and let's get into this. Her passive, as it currently stands, simply gives her half gravity at all times. It's not bad, but it's not really great either. I personally don't love how floaty she is all the time, but I don't think it really hurts her at all. So I'd only make one change. After using any of her abilities, Zephyr would gain 50% damage reduction for about 5 seconds. This simply gives her a passive that actually affects gameplay and brings it more in line with most other passives. Tailwind is very fun to use as a movement tool, even though it was made somewhat obsolete by the Parkour 2.0 changes. It deals a very minuscule amount of damage, and is extremely inefficient to use for that reason. Personally, I'd like to see it deal a lot more damage with a decent status chance, and possibly making it scale with melee mods. On top of that, I would give it a combo timer like Atlas's Landslide, and make it so that Zephyr passes through and staggers all of the enemies that she impacts. This would give her some reliable damage and light crowd control, while also making it much cheaper to use repeatedly. I don't mind the upward jump you get when activating Tailwind from the ground, but I wouldn't necessarily be sad to see it go either. I actually find Dive Bomb quite fun to use, regardless of its effectiveness. Honestly, its biggest problem is simply how clunky it is. I want to be able to use it in the middle of a crowd to disrupt them all, so that I can pick them off while they're down. But to accomplish that, I have to first run into the middle of all the guys who are currently shooting at me, do a little hop, and then face plant into the ground. After all that, if I'm not already dead, only the few closest guys to me actually get knocked down, and I've almost wasted more time than I've bought. To fix this, Zephyr should simply do a small backflip up and backward in the air before she dives, and also allow you to aim her subsequent dash downward. With this, and my Tailwind changes, I don't think that Dive Bomb's focus should be on damage. Rather, it should be a utility disruption tool, to turn a bad situation into a good one. To further cement it as such, it should make Zephyr immune to damage while in the animation, and it could also slow the affected enemies for a few seconds after it impacts. Turbulence really doesn't need much, if anything. It is by far her best ability, and as it turns out, effective invulnerability to all projectiles is really good. The only thing I would even consider changing is simply allowing it to be recast. Nothing else is even needed. Tornado is in a similar boat as Tailwind. Fun, but not really that useful. Its damage is very lackluster, its crowd control is more annoying than useful, and it usually makes things harder to kill rather than easier, so I often find myself activating it near a group of enemies and then walking away to an entirely different part of the map to go kill entirely unrelated enemies. If it pulled enemies in and around in a far less violent manner and at a much slower speed, while also holding them closer to the center of the tornado, you might actually be able to shoot them while they are trapped. I do like the elemental emphasis the ability has, but I'd like it to be a little more interesting. This could be accomplished by completely removing its near useless base damage, but allowing it to absorb all of the elemental damage shot into it, dealing it back over time similarly to Mag's Magnetize. It would also be nice if it had a substantial status chance, in case you want to strip armor, light everything on fire, throw out a bunch of gas clouds, or simply blow up the bad guys. With all this, Zephyr could be a very good disruption-based off-tank. She wouldn't necessarily be able to take tons of damage, but she could easily avoid and stop a lot of damage. It would also allow her to get around a lot easier and have a distinct use for each of her abilities. It would also leave her very similar to how she currently is, meaning everyone doesn't have to relearn and remod her to be able to be effective. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I plan to make another rework video soon, and depending on what gets shown in tomorrow's dev stream, it may or may not be Atlas.